All right, let's jump right in. Tariffs sparking a comeback in U.S. chip manufacturing. It's a surprising twist, isn't it?
Well, maybe not entirely surprising to everyone. Some folks saw this coming.
Right, they even coined that term a three-sided win.
Exactly.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the real impact of these recent tariffs. We're talking specifically about those from the second Trump administration.
Yeah, looking at how they're affecting the semiconductor industry, both, here in the U.S. and globally.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how a trade tool like tariffs is being used, maybe strategically, for such a critical tech sector.
Absolutely. And to really wrap our heads around it, we've gathered quite a range of sources.
What have we got?
Well, there's a Valuetainment YouTube transcript, which has a pretty strong take.
Yeah.
Then a very detailed PIIE briefing from just this year, January 2025.
Good, some academic rigor.
Definitely. Plus, articles from the Future of Commerce, Infosys, Semi-Analysis, and we've got Wikipedia, too, just to keep the basic facts straight.
Perfect. So the mission today,
I think it's to get beyond the headlines, really understand why tariffs are being used to try and boost U.S. chip making.
right, look at the potential upsides, the potential downsides.
The risks, yeah. And the whole geopolitical tangle that comes with it.
It's definitely complex.
Yeah.
And our sources, I imagine they don't all sing the same tune.
Not at all. Different viewpoints, which is good. It gives us a fuller picture.
So right off the bat, you have to wonder, is this mainly about economics?
Yeah.
Or national security?
Or maybe, a bit of both. That valuetainment piece we mentioned, it argues pretty strongly that tariffs are the key driver.
The catalyst for this huge chip comeback to the U.S., as they put it.
Yeah, and they frame it as this three-sided win.
Okay, let's break that down. What's side one?
Side one is for American workers. They specifically mention Arizona getting a boost.
Makes sense. Lots of activity there. Side two?
Getting ahead of China, market share, chip production, basically beating the competition.
And they have a prediction tied to that.
Yeah, a bold one. They predict the U.S. will actually make more chips than South Korea within 5 years.
Wow, okay. That's ambitious. What's the third side of this win?
This one's interesting. It's about reducing risk related to Taiwan.
The geopolitical angle again. So less reliance on Taiwan means less vulnerability if things get unstable there.
That's the idea, according to their analysis. A stronger domestic base equals more security.
But it's not all positive predictions in that piece, is it?
No, definitely not. They pivot pretty quickly to potential Chinese responses to all this pressure.
What kind of responses are they talking about?
It's quite a list. Cyber attacks, hitting the power grid,
Okay, serious stuff.
issues with the Panama Canal, internal espionage. They even float the possibility, and this is a big claim,
Yeah.
of another virus.
Wow. Okay, that covers a lot of ground, from economic levers to potentially kinetic actions.
It's a very broad and frankly concerning set of possibilities they lay out. But their main point seems to be that this whole tariff strategy, it's primarily focused on China.
Right, and it connects to some of the other analysis too, like from Futurum Intelligence.
Exactly. Futurum points to this U.S.-China tech race as a major driver behind, deglobalization in the semiconductor supply chain. Things moving away from that interconnected model.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. The PIIE briefing, that gives us a different lens, right? More academic, historical.
Yes, exactly. They frame the GPS and Science Act as a clear example of industrial policy.
Meaning the government deliberately trying to shape an industry.
Precisely. In this case, aiming to seriously ramp up U.S. semiconductor foundry construction.
And now, just any chips.
No, specifically the really high-end stuff. Leading-edge logic chips, the brains of modern tech.
What I found interesting was the historical context they brought in.
Oh, yeah, that's crucial. They remind us this isn't new for the U.S.
Right, industrial policy has happened before, especially during, say, the Cold War.
Absolutely. Think about government involvement in things like missile tech, nuclear power,
Computers, transistors.
satellites, the internet, even GPS. A lot of those foundational technologies got a big government push early on.
They even looked back at a 2021 PIIE report on decades of this stuff. How did it rate?
Well, it was kind of mixed, Slightly more misses than hits when it came to beating global competition directly.
Okay.
But a better track record when the goal was pushing the technological frontier, like pure innovation.
So throwing money at it doesn't guarantee you'll win the market, but it can spark breakthroughs. Is that the idea?
That seems to be the takeaway from past efforts. The briefing is a bit cautious, though, about whether the current subsidies post-2020 will have the same effect. It's maybe too early to tell.
They also crunched some numbers on jobs, right?
They did. Estimates are around 93,000 temporary construction jobs and maybe 43,000 permanent ones.
That sounds pretty good.
It does, but they add a caveat. The average subsidy cost per job per year works out to be roughly twice the average annual salary in the semiconductor industry.
Oof. So it raises questions about, well, efficiency, bang for your buck.
Exactly. Is it the most cost-effective way to create those jobs?
And here's something else that caught my eye from PIE. The U.S. is already dominant in chip design, right?
World leading, yeah.
But the CHIPS Act didn't really focus on boosting R&D tax credits much more?
Right, which is interesting because the U.S. actually lags behind countries like China when it comes to R&D subsidies for big, profitable firms.
So it suggests the real focus here is squarely on the manufacturing side, maybe less on maintaining that design edge.
It certainly looks that way based on where the big money is going. And globally, PII points out, everyone's getting in on this act.
You mean other countries are ramping up their own subsidies?
Yeah, it's becoming a trend. Governments intervening, reacting to what other governments are doing, sort of a subsidy race.
How does the CHIPS Act funding break down specifically?
The grants and loans are mostly targeted. They're for those advanced and leading-edge projects.
Driven by national security concerns, presumably.
That's the rationale given. But there's also that 25% investment tax credit, which is much broader. More companies can potentially use that.
So a mix of targeted and broader incentives.
Seems like it. And they also mention that state-level subsidies have played a role historically, too.
Like New York supporting global foundries.
That's the example they used. So government support isn't just a federal thing.
Did they compare the U.S. approach to other countries, like Japan?
Briefly. They mentioned Japan's historical model involved things like low-interest loans, a huge focus on quality, vertically integrated companies, and joint research. Some definite differences.
And China. They must have covered China's efforts.
Oh, yeah. A long history there. Big subsidies through things like the National IC Plan, Made in China 2025.
Plus efforts to acquire technology from the West.
Right. Lots of M&A activity, especially with U.S. firms, before things tightened up around 2017.
Europe's trying to catch up too, I gather.
They are. The European Chips Act aims to double their global production share. There are specific projects mentioned in Germany and France. It's really a global scramble.
What about the actual subsidy numbers? Who's spending the most?
It's tricky to compare data sets perfectly, but PIIE's analysis suggests China likely has the largest announced totals for 2020-2024.
Followed by?
The EU, and then the U.S. But, and this is a key point they make,
Yeah.
spending the most doesn't automatically mean you have the strongest industry or the best competitive edge.
Right. Money isn't everything.
Yeah.
But the goals are huge everywhere, aren't they?
Definitely. The briefing outlines these really ambitious production targets for the next decade from all the major players. The U.S., for instance, aims to make 20% of the world's most advanced logic chips by 2030.
Which is up from basically zero right now.
Exactly. And they reiterate the main goal of the GIPS Act, economic and national security through domestic manufacturing.
Yeah.
Cost is, well, a secondary factor.
They list some specific projects getting GOJPS money, right?
Yeah.
Intel, TSMC.
Yep. Intel in Arizona and New Mexico, TSMC in Arizona too, Samsung down in Texas, Micron in New York and Idaho. They detail the grants, the loans, the expected tax credits.
Gives you a real sense of where the money's flowing.
Also projects from Global Foundries, Infinera, and they even look at the political map, which states, red or blue, are benefiting.
But they circle back to that fundamental question.
Does just making more chips here automatically make the U.S. more secure?
It's not a simple yes or no, is it?
Definitely not. Which leads us nicely into the challenges of actually doing this reshoring.
Right. The Future of Commerce article really dug into that.
Yeah, they emphasize just how massive a task it is, building these giant factories, these fabs.
It takes years, billions of dollars.
And a huge specialized workforce. They threw out a number, 115,000 projected jobs needed.
But the catch?
A potential shortfall of maybe 67,000 workers because there just aren't enough engineers, enough technicians with the right skills.
That's a massive potential bottleneck right there.
Huge. And then there's the cost.
Ah, yes. Always the cost. It's more expensive to build and run fabs here, isn't it?
Significantly. The article says maybe 30% more than Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and potentially 50% more than China.
That's a big hurdle for competitiveness. How do you overcome that?
Good question. And tied into that is something called yields.
Explain that.
Yield is basically the percentage of chips you produce that actually work correctly, without defects. It's critical for profitability.
Okay.
And the article points out that when U.S. companies moved manufacturing offshore, a lot of the expertise in analyzing and improving yields went with it.
So we need to rebuild that know-how.
Exactly. That deep practical knowledge of optimizing the production
They
line.
mentioned AI might help there.
Potentially, yeah. AI tools for spotting patterns, predicting maintenance needs, analyzing yield data faster, that could be an advantage.
And connecting everything up. Production systems, business systems.
Crucial, they argue. For a reshored industry to be truly competitive, you need that tight integration. Data flowing smoothly from the factory floor to the boardroom.
Okay, let's look at the Infosys outlook for 2025. How's the industry doing overall?
Unevenly seems to be the word for 2024.
How so?
Well, fabless companies, the ones that design chips but don't make them, and IP companies did pretty well.
But the manufacturers.
The IDMs, the integrated guys who do both design and manufacturing, and also the equipment suppliers, they faced maybe slower growth or even contraction, supply chain issues, costs.
And consolidation continues. Mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, that trend is ongoing.
Financially, though, how are the margins?
Surprisingly resilient overall in 2024. Average margins actually went up. But again, big differences between the segments.
Interesting. Any shifts in business models expected?
Infosys suggests we might see more of those big IDMs consider outsourcing their manufacturing, going fabless, essentially.
Which would benefit the big contract manufacturers like TSMC.
Potentially, yes. And what's driving the growth that is happening?
Let me guess. AI.
Bingo. Data centers fueled by AI advancements are a primary engine for semiconductor sales right now. Huge demand for powerful chips.
But Infosys also flags some big challenges.
Oh, yeah. Geopolitics, obviously U.S.-China tensions, Taiwan uncertainty.
Supply chain disruptions still lingering.
Yep. Trade barriers, raw material shortages, delays in getting new fabs online.
And something we keep hearing about, power.
Absolutely. Power consumption is a massive issue, especially for data centers, sustainability concerns, greenhouse gas emissions. It's becoming critical.
Data centers are just getting so power hungry with all this AI.
Hugely. Infosys notes projections that data center energy use could double by 2026. Microsoft's CEO even said power availability, not chips, is becoming the bottleneck in some places.
Wow, that shifts the focus, doesn't it?
It really does. Energy efficiency is paramount.
Yeah.
And then there's the talent crunch again.
Still not enough skilled workers.
That persistent problem. Lots of unfilled positions.
And given the money involved, the secrets. Cybersecurity must be huge.
Absolutely critical. Infosys stresses this. Huge R&D investments, national security implications. Protecting IP is vital.
Have there been breaches?
They mention recent cyber attacks, IP theft cases. It underscores the need for really robust security across the board.
What about new tech driving things forward?
Infosys highlights things like advanced packaging, how chips are assembled together.
New materials.
Yep, finding better materials for performance and efficiency, and using AI itself in the manufacturing design process to make things faster and more precise.
Okay, now, Tariff Armageddon. That's quite a title from Semi-Analysis.
It is provocative, yeah. They break down how the Trump tariffs actually work.
There's a baseline, country-specific rates.
Right, but also key exclusions. Pharmaceuticals, semiconductors themselves are mostly excluded from the new baseline tariffs.
Okay, that's important.
Also lumber, some critical minerals, energy goods. So it's not a blanket tariff on everything.
But there's that loophole they mentioned, USMCA.
The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, yeah. It means currently you can import finished GPU servers from Mexico or Canada without facing these big tariffs.
Even if the GPUs inside them originally came from, say, Taiwan, and would face a tariff if imported directly.
Exactly. A 32% tariff on GPUs from Taiwan directly, but put them in a server in Mexico. And voila.
That definitely creates some weird incentives for supply chains.
You bet. Semi-analysis details how different countries reacted to. China, obviously, with rapid escalation, retaliatory tariffs, export controls on rare earths.
The EU threatened tariffs too.
Proposed ones, yeah. Targeting things like steel and aluminum. It's a messy picture.
And Mexico's role as an assembly hub.
Becomes even more important. Semi-analysis sees a potential shift. Companies moving assembly there to avoid tariffs on goods coming directly from Asia.
What about smaller parts, components, and servers?
Less impact expected there, they think. Because of that China plus one strategy already happening, companies diversifying away from just China anyway.
Any companies positioned particularly well or badly?
They suggest AMD might benefit. Their standalone CPUs are exempt, and they've been moving server manufacturing to Mexico and the U.S.
Okay. Who might get hurt?
maybe makers of optical modules. Costs could go up due to tariffs unless they have very localized supply chains, like Lumentum apparently does.
What about the equipment needed to make the chips, the stuff that goes in the fabs?
That's a big one. Semi-analysis estimates tariffs could make building a U.S. fab about 15% more expensive.
Ouch. That disadvantages anyone building heavily in the U.S.
Potentially, yes, especially since the U.S. relies heavily on foreign suppliers for critical equipment. ASML for lithography, Tokyo Electron.
And essential materials, too. Wafers, chemicals.
Yeah, they point out the U.S. doesn't have much domestic capacity for things like the big 300-millimeter silicon wafer blanks or key chemicals like photoresist, which mostly come from Japan.
So tariffs could make building the U.S. supply chain more expensive.
Ironically, yes. And here's another potential own goal they raise.
Fuck that.
Raising tariffs too high on Taiwan could actually hurt U.S. AI development by making those cutting-edge Taiwanese chips harder or more expensive to get.
It really is a balancing act, isn't it?
Extremely delicate. And they also briefly mentioned potential EU retaliation beyond tariffs, like taxing big tech or cloud services, more economic ripples.
Okay, finally, let's touch on a Wikipedia summary of the second Trump administration tariffs. It confirms these went into effect in 2025.
Yes, it gives that timeline. And it mentions the formula the administration used, linking tariffs to trade deficits.
Which got criticized.
Heavily. For being too simplistic, not reflecting how trade actually works.
That was a market reaction again?
Sharp drops in the S&P 500, NASDAQ, Dow Jones right after the announcement in April 2025. Markets don't like uncertainty.
And legal challenges.
Yep. Questioning whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEPA, was the right legal basis for these broad tariffs.
Wikipedia also lists the specifics, right? Tariffs on Canada, China, Mexico.
And their retaliations, yeah. Highlighting that escalating cycle, especially with China.
Did it mention investigations into semiconductor tariffs specifically?
Yes, investigations initiated into tariffs on semiconductors and the equipment to make them, and it confirms tariffs were applied to imports from Taiwan as well.
So bringing it all together, the geopolitical angle seems inescapable. Carnegie Endowment, Futurum Intelligence, they emphasize this U.S.-China tech race.
It's clearly a massive driver. U.S. export controls on China, blacklisting companies like Huawei and SMIC, restricting access to key tools like EUV lithography machines.
It's all part of trying to reshape that supply chain.
And Futurum really highlights those single points of failure in the current system.
Like Taiwan for advanced manufacturing.
China for rare earths.
Europe for that specialized lithography equipment.
The U.S. is still deeply reliant on all of them, even as it tries to build up its own capabilities.
Wow, okay. It is genuinely a complex, multi-layered situation.
Definitely. You've got potential wins for U.S. manufacturing, maybe for national security.
But also huge risks, likely higher costs spreading through the economy.
It's a massive gamble in many ways.
So the key takeaway seems to be tariffs are being used very deliberately as a tool.
A major tool, yeah. To try and force a shift in the global semiconductor map, bring advanced manufacturing home for security and economic reasons.
But the headwinds are significant.
Enormous. Cost competitiveness, finding the skilled workforce, potential retaliation from other countries, and just the sheer difficulty of untangling these incredibly complex global supply chains that took decades to build.
Whether it will ultimately succeed and what the full impact will be, that's still very much up in the air.
Absolutely. The long-term consequences are far from clear.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah, thinking about everything we've discussed, the tariffs, the subsidies like the Cheap OPS Act, this intense global competition, the technology itself always changing. What do you think is the single biggest hurdle the U.S. faces in actually achieving this goal of reshoring semiconductor?
Is it the cost, the workforce, the reliance on foreign tech, geopolitics?
And maybe just as important, what unintended consequences might pop up down the road from this massive global shift? Something we haven't even thought of yet.
Definitely a lot to chew on there. We really encourage you to check out the sources we mentioned if you want to dig deeper.
And keep thinking critically about this. It's a story that's unfolding right now, and it affects, well, pretty much everything.